Happy Monday and welcome to Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. Wherever you found us, do us a favor and like the show, subscribe, and share it as far and as wide as you can. We really appreciate it. I am Hogan Brock. He is Harrison Litzel. Before we get into the Bible a little bit, let's get into, I don't know, whatever else is going on. What's up, Harrison?
Just hanging out. VBS was this past week, and so done with that, which is good. It's nice to just have that off my plate. And now we are on pretty serious baby watch here. Pretty
Mm,
much any day now, we are going to have our second child, and so it's this kind of weird, fun game of hopefully it's soon because my wife is pretty miserably uncomfortable being very pregnant in July, but also having a newborn is a lot of work, and so trying to sleep as much as we can before that happens. So yeah,
yeah,
fun stuff. How about you? How's Toronto?
Toronto's fine. We talked to some people today, and a couple of people actually, and they asked how much of Toronto we'd explored, and we said really like half a mile or zero point 0.8 kilometers. I think that's the the conversion. Um, we've really only explored, yeah, like the half mile around our apartment because there's just so much. We're in the middle of the
Mm.
city, and we can't get outside of that. But we did go to Kensington Market today, which is like a big, I don't know, kind of a famous area of Toronto and Chinatown. It's awesome, cool stuff there. So yeah, getting used to it a little bit, getting used to riding public transportation again, right? Like that's just a different kind of rhythm. So yeah, it's been good. You, so I know you work at a church, but you
I
don't
do.
work like in children's ministry specifically. So what's your kind of involvement with VBS? Like I'm curious about that Vacation Bible School.
Yeah. So I work at a church. That's right. I work with the preschool, and so I work like during the week for the preschool that we have there at the church. I used to work in the children's ministry, and since I left the children's ministry and went into this new role, I have worked on a contract basis for VBS. And so, what I do for our church is I take a curriculum that is published by someone that we find, and then I adapt it to our needs. And so, this year, that meant that I took this curriculum and I used the Bible stories that they use and some of the kind of the main themes, but I wrote videos and wrote Bible studies and wrote small group lessons and all that kind of stuff and kind of made it work for our ministry. And so this year, we recorded a lot of videos beforehand. I did the Bible story stuff. I was Mr. Harry. Usually people don't call me Harry, but that was the kind of the character, and it was kind of a Mr. Rogers character.
Mm.
Mr. Rogers meets YouTube a little bit is kind of how I did it. Um, and so I filmed all those, and then the week of, I helped out with some AV stuff, but really stayed behind the scenes, which is a nice way to do VBS, to do some of that prep work and writing and things like that, but not the chaos that is the week of because it can be a lot. So
Yeah, cool. I have seen some of your curriculum, and I don't know if you're open for business or not, but if folks want curriculum written, contact Harrison.
yeah.
Um, we've got a couple of big weeks coming up for the show. So our website is going to launch this Wednesday. So you can be following Harrison or I on different social media platforms for the launch of that. That'll be the place where you can find the podcast feed. If you're not getting it on a podcast player, if you just want to watch it or listen to it on your computer, you can also find a little more about Harrison and I there, a little biographical information, as well as things that Harrison or I are writing. So there'll be a blog section. Harrison has written some things that have been published in the past. We'll try and link those, but we'll try to get some content up there, written content as well. Uh, we also have, hopefully today, Monday, our Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages will all be up. You should be able to find any of those by searching Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. So check those out, like those, follow. You can get a little extra content there as well. And then want to announce ahead of time, I don't think I've ever announced a guest like a week in advance. But we have Grayson Hester coming on. Grayson was a college classmate of Harrison and I, and went to seminary with Harrison at McAfee. And Grayson is, I checked the follower count of everyone who's been on our show. He is by far the most famous person that's come on the podcast. So we're looking forward to him. So please check that out next week. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into our scripture for the week. As we do each week, we'll dive in with no preparation, and we'll spend about 5 minutes talking about it, seeing what we can get into. Our scripture this week is Psalm 78, 23 to 29, and I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version this week. So Psalm 78, 23 to 29. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down on them manna to eat, and gave them the grain of heaven. Mortals ate the bread of angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he led out the south wind. He rained flesh upon them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall within their camp and all around their dwellings. And they ate and were filled, for he gave them what they craved. So, Harrison, did you hear that psalm? What are some initial thoughts? What did you hear?
Yeah, so the first thing that I thought of was when I spoke with Marquette Bug a couple weeks ago, we had a psalm from the lectionary where it kind of cut in here in the middle, and that just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know who chooses the lectionary. Like, I don't know who's in charge of this.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm showing my ignorance here. I'm just now realizing I know so little about the lectionary, but it's so interesting to me that for the second time here we have this psalm, this poem where the lectionary is like, oh no, don't worry about the whole thing. You only need this small part, and that's just so interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. I was in a Bible study back in Richmond before we moved to Toronto that um, we followed the lectionary every week and often talked about like if we read what was around the lectionary passages, we were surprised by like, oh, like that's actually the hard stuff.
Yeah,
And so I do think the lectionary can cut out some of the more challenging passages at times. Um, I just for context here, I just went back to verse 21, so just a couple of verses back, and the two preceding verses are therefore when the Lord heard he was full of rage, a fire was kindled against Jacob, his anger mounted against Israel because they had no faith in God, and he did not trust his saving power. So, right, like that's such important context for this
yeah,
passage.
yeah. I just now realized that the first word of verse 23, where you started that first time, is yet. Like,
Yeah,
this word that is known for being not the beginning of a thought, but the like turning point in a thought. And yeah, that is so interesting. Of just, I feel like in a lot of ways, the lectionary is emblematic of the way we treat scripture, right? If we pick this part and this part, and part of it, I think that sometimes we kind of levy that as a critique, and I think it is inevitable in some ways. Like, you're never going to get the full context, because the context of scripture especially is just, it contains so much. It contains the culture of the people who wrote it, the culture of the people who have interpreted it throughout the years, the culture of us sitting here. Like, we're always going to miss out on stuff. But I do feel like in a lot of ways, specifically when we're looking at the lectionary of these psalms, it is emblematic of this way in which we read scripture, where we start with a yet, and don't even consider what came before that. And here it is, the wrath of God, and that's what just came before, while we're talking about the manna falling from heaven.
yeah, yeah. And I have to add the context at the end too, because it's not. So just reading those first two and adding it on, I was like, okay, like this is a redemption arc, or it's an arc of grace. Um, but then we get in verse 30, but before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them and laid low the flower of Israel. Right? Like
Yeah,
so, the lectionary passage pulls out this. I read it and I thought, well, that's incredibly beautiful, and it is. It is. I love the way that it, in English at least, it's rendered in the NRSV. Mortals ate the bread of angels. Like that's such a beautiful sentiment, and I don't think it's lost necessarily with the context, but it does change the way that you see it.
yeah. The author seems so much more angry with that line, right? With that other context of like, mortals ate the bread of angels. Like, can you believe what they were given, and yet this is what's going on. Yeah, I mean, I feel like another thing that we're showing here is how little preparation we do. Like, I know that's the point of the podcast, but like, I feel like I shouldn't be this flabbergasted by the topic of the thing that we're sitting here talking about. The listeners and the viewers don't know this, but we've made a whole $2 doing this, and I feel like we're showing that we don't prepare for it. But it also just brings us to these places where, yeah, when you first read the scripture, I was like, yeah, those themes of memory and remembering, and just the sustenance that God provides, and and the stories, the ways that we keep talking about the Bible and these conversations of how important storytelling is and how important it is to people throughout generations of Christ followers. I feel like so much of that was in 23 and 29, and then in 21, 22, and 30, 31 is just the wrath of God and God
Yeah.
smiting the people. And that, what was that last line? It was lay low the flower of Israel. Like, this is
Yeah.
not imagery that we often like to dwell on, even as it surrounds the stuff that I would love to preach a sermon on remembering the manna that fell from heaven, and mortals eating the bread of the angels. Yeah, like, what beautiful imagery.
Yeah, absolutely. There was the sermon that I heard this past Sunday in worship. Um, I felt like it did something very similar. Um, I felt like it was cherry picking a little bit, particularly as we kind of ascribe things to God. Um, and so, yeah, like I do want to wrestle for just a second with the image of Lord or God as described here is full of rage, or as in verse 31, he killed the strongest of them. We get these very violent images of who God is. And as someone who um, has studied and been around a Mennonite context that's a very pacifist context, this is some like the violent language that we see for God, especially here, where it's attributing death to God, and this happens again in Chronicles and in the Book of Kings, where there's genocide associated with God, or attributed to God, or given thanks for to God. These images of God as a violent killer are images that I really struggle with, that I really wrestle with, and I think there are ways that I at times explain them away. Right, there are ways that I can say, and I think this is true to some extent. This is the writer, perhaps prescribing something that has happened and attributing that to God. Um, but at the same time, this is in text that I call sacred and I call holy. And so, how do I wrestle with this image of God as violent? So I'm curious. We've had this conversation before off mic, but I'm curious how you kind of wrestle with that.
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this. I feel like I grew up in a context in which violence attributed to God was normal and natural and right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then I went through a time, as I was going through late, kind of graduating high school and into the time when I met you, when I was very much so in a place of nonviolence and completely and totally and wholly. And now I feel like I've kind of come back to this other place of, maybe I don't the violence of God. I don't know, and I don't know the role of violence, but I do feel like there are times that for me as a straight white cisgendered man to look at the people in the world and say, hey, stop being violent,
mm,
is not helpful and is not right, because I have benefited so much from violence in the world. For me to now turn to others and say God says don't do that, is hypocritical to say the least,
yeah.
and continuing violence in so many ways. And so I don't know. I feel like this is a place where I do my best to listen, to what other people are saying, specifically people from historically oppressed, groups, because I feel like, for someone who has benefited from the violence that has been attributed to God and to Christianity for so long, it's probably a good idea for me to listen to what other people have to say. But again, and this all kind of comes down to, you can talk about it in these grand themes of history, but at the violence does harm to people, and whenever I think about death and things like that, I just always think of the family member of that person, and what they thought about what that person was doing with their life, and now they carry this grief, and what grief does and how that spirals and grows. And yeah, I mean, I feel like it is not a hot take to say I wish violence didn't have to happen, but I wonder if sometimes maybe it is the only option forward.
Hmm. Yeah, that's such important context. You're absolutely right. So I appreciate that framing. I'm also interested, maybe as we kind of wrap up here, in the as we discovered the framing of this text as it was pulled out in the lectionary. How do you see this? How do you see this sandwich
Mm,
of two, the beginning of Therefore, when the Lord heard he was full of rage in the end, he killed the strongest of them, and he laid the flower of Israel. He laid low the flower of Israel. But in the middle, we have the psalmist saying, God provided all of this, um, above and beyond what was needed, and gives this, yeah, this mystical kind of magical, miracle sense in mortals ate the bread of angels. There's something extraordinary happening here, and there's an interesting, image of God here. I think in that God is full of rage, uh, and yet God provides. Um, so I'm curious how you see this framing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does just allow me to dwell on the complexity of God, right? That I the sandwich of rage and then laying low the flower of Israel along with the miracle in the middle, that is something to me that's not human.
Mm,
That's something that is more complex, that is more perhaps enduring in certain ways. Um, but I also think that I do kind of come back to the way that this writer, and I scrolled, I'm on my phone, I scrolled up to the top and saw that it is a psalm of Asaph, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is our professor, Dr. Christine Jones. I believe that that was her, what her dissertation was on. And so I think for the second time here, we're wishing that we had her on this podcast. But um, thinking about what his perspective of, what is he remembering and what is he thinking about as he writes this, and his perspective on God, and what is the reality of who God is versus how we as humans perceive the divine. Because there's always going to be interpretation and context and stuff in there as well.
mm. Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. So as we kind of, wrap up here, we'll give some initial things that we might want to look into if we're going to spend some more time with this passage. First and foremost, for me, I just want to read the rest of the psalm.
Yeah.
There are 20 verses that come before and like nearly 40 that come after.
Mm.
So we're getting such a tiny piece of this story, and it's not even contextualized in the, what was kind of placed around it, in the book of Psalms. So that's where I would start. Just reading a little more. Where would you go?
Yeah. My first response is I don't think I'm coming back. I
Yeah.
think I'm gonna move on. Um, it's just, but I mean, I think that what you said of, like, I do think I owe it to just read the rest of it. Like, even if whoever's in charge of lectionary, I think maybe that's what I'm gonna do, figure out who writes the lectionary. um but even if they decided not to include this whole psalm, I think I owe it to the writer, and to the ages of followers who have read this, to read the whole thing, because as I kind of scroll through it quickly, it does look like it's a history, right? It
Mm,
is an act of remembrance, and that's going to involve rage, and that's going to involve miracles, and to think about how we remember our stories and how we remember those who came before us and how they interacted with God. I think that's, a worthy way to spend some time.
mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's awesome. So, thank you so much, Harrison, for this conversation. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, to you who are listening and watching. We appreciate your time spent with us. Again, please like and subscribe wherever you found us, and share, to as many people as you can. We really appreciate it. It's encouraging to see those numbers go up each week. So, until next week, keep trying to read the Bible.